This is something that I almost never hear the techno-optimist talking about, which is about how coal as a technology evokes these stories of heroism and of people sacrificing great things for their community, and of the community spirit that has been eroded as the world has modernized. And I think even though coal jobs might not be so prevalent and might not have a big economic impact bringing them back, this idea that we want workers who are brave, who are do backbreaking work and um, are important pillars of society, I think is an overlooked one in the story of coal and the transition.
Welcome back to An Electric Revolution. I'm your host, Henry Sanderson. Why do we continue to burn so much coal? Global coal demand likely hit another record high of over 8.85 billion tonnes last year. And global coal demand is likely to continue to plateau until the end of the decade, showing only a slight decline by 2030. This is at the same time that costs for renewable energy such as solar and batteries have declined considerably, making it even cheaper than coal-fired power in many parts of the world. So what's going on? Why do we continue to burn this dirtiest of fuels, only adding carbon emissions to the atmosphere and worsening the impacts of climate change? I'm delighted to be joined by Lucy Shaw. She's CEO of Gordon Management, and she writes a Slow Burn newsletter on Substack. She's writing and researching a book on coal, which has seen her travel to India, the US, Indonesia, and elsewhere. So without further ado, here's our conversation. Thanks so much for joining me today. I'm delighted to have you on my podcast. I think one of the really interesting things about your research is it tackles this dichotomy between, we keep hearing that costs of renewables are getting ever cheaper and cheaper, whether it's solar or batteries. But yeah, at the same time, we're burning more coal than we ever have in our entire history, with coal demand set to remain at record levels this year, according to the IEA. I think what's interesting, what you look at is some of the reasons why we continue to burn coal, and that it might not all be to do with cost. I wondered if you could outline the thesis of your research that's going into your new book.
Thanks for having me on the show. Thanks for having me on the podcast, Henry. It's really great to be talking to you about this topic. So what initially got me interested in understanding a bit more about the coal sector are these news reports about renewable costs coming down. And finally, we're at a point where we can get reliable, cheap renewables that in theory should be able to allow us to decarbonize the energy system and also make it cheaper and more resilient. So in recent years, it was surprising to me to note that coal consumption has grown and grown, reaching new peaks even as late as last year. This year might be different. They've been saying this year might be different for several years now. And my research is unpacking the reasons why coal might persist beyond the technical and economic constraints of the energy system itself. And so if renewables can deliver baseload power or reliable power, if they can deliver that at cheaper cost, then it stands to reason that politics is a big factor in why coal might not phase out as quickly as some analysts might think. And when I think about the politics of coal, they aren't always nefarious politics. They can be very real constraints that governments and planners face in managing the economy. For the coal industry, there's several benefits that it offers beyond just cheap electricity. I'll talk about 6 of those. So one of them is jobs. Now, the job story is decreasing in importance in many countries because of mechanization and technology improvements, which mean that we don't need as many workers to get the same amount of coal out the ground. The second factor is on foreign exchange. Coal is often used in the country that mines it. Only about 1/6 of coal is internationally traded, and so it tends to be a very local fuel. And its economics depend on that as well, because it costs a lot to transport it the further away it is from a power plant. And so you're keeping the energy system within your borders, which helps you then reduce the imports and foreign currency needs that you have for energy. That's related to geopolitical independence, but isn't exactly the same thing, where countries may have tons of foreign exchange, but they don't want to be dependent on a foreign power for access to something so critical as energy. Now, a fourth factor is political interests and donations. And I include in this category where sometimes politicians have interests in coal mining companies or coal adjacent businesses. This happens in countries around the world, in many different markets. And it also happens when you have political systems that favor narrow voices, um, with outsized representation for smaller communities. This is by design. It's so that some smaller communities can have more of a voice in national politics, but it does mean that you can have the interests of a small minority sometimes trumping the interests of a larger majority. I think a fifth factor that's important in many different countries is the tax revenue that coal offers. Some countries own their own coal mines, India being a great example, and it generates tens of billions in tax revenue from the dividends, from royalties, from income taxes, and it can help subsidize other sectors like rail. And I think a sixth factor that's really interesting in light of Trump getting reelected is coal's power in the culture war narratives. This is something that I almost never hear the techno optimists talking about, which is about how coal as a technology evokes these stories of heroism and of people sacrificing great things for their community, and of the community spirit that has been eroded as the world has modernized. And I think even though coal jobs might not be so prevalent and might not have a big economic impact bringing them back, this idea that we want workers who are brave, who are do backbreaking work and um, uh, are important pillars of society, I think is an overlooked one in the story of coal and the transition.
Well, thanks so much, Lucy. That's all of those points are fascinating. Just picking up on the United States, this is perhaps the most prominent example of politics trying to actually bring coal back. Now, during Trump's first term, he didn't do very well and coal plants closed because of costs. But this time, like in so many other things, he's determined to do better. And he's actually stepping in and preventing coal-fired power plants from retiring, despite perhaps the additional costs. And the IEA says coal demand in the US is going to increase 8% last year. So can he succeed, do you think, in actually bringing back what he calls beautiful, clean coal?
Yeah, the American story is interesting because there are tailwinds at the moment that are helping the coal industry that haven't been in place for the prior couple of years. And a couple of those are by Trump's design, and some of them are external. The two I would highlight that are increasing the need for coal, at least in the past year, one of them is the the explosion in electricity demand that the US in particular is seeing from data centers, and how it's using that narrative to delay the closure of coal plants, and also to increase the supply of all sorts of different fuels on the grid, not just coal, but gas, investigating geothermal, bringing back retired nuclear plants even, to make sure that these data centers have enough supply. So I think that's positive for the coal industry in the short to medium term until the supply issues shake out for the data center boom. I think the second piece that Trump's energy policies, the second way that Trump's energy policies support coal is that he's really pushed for gas exports via LNG. And this has raised, unsurprisingly, the domestic price of gas because it now then gets tied to international markets and reduces the supply available for local consumption. This then makes coal more competitive against gas in some markets if gas prices have gone up. Coal otherwise in the US has been in a structural decline for a very long time. Coal jobs have been in structural decline for decades, and coal power for the last several decades, partly because power plants have reached their end of life. Maintaining them is expensive, and there isn't an economic case for new coal power plants, given where power prices are and coal coal mining prices are. Um, it's also partly because of regulation to make coal less environmentally and less environmentally harmful and less harmful to human health. Which has also changed where coal is sourced from the US. So West Virginian coal, in particular, and Appalachian coal in that region, has gone down, even as coal in the western part of the US has become more prominent because they have different pollutants and therefore different costs at the power plant to mitigate against these. Trump's also rolling back some of these health regulations, both for power plants to make them cheaper, but also for workers themselves, meaning they have fewer protections as they go to work in mining jobs. So not all of his policies are pro coal worker in the sense that they don't protect them from harms in the industry, but they do seem to be pro coal in general. And I think that the trend of coal going out of the US energy system will, in general, continue. But Trump does have levers to keep supporting the coal industry and keep it cost effective, including rolling back taxes at a federal level, for example.
Some of it's obviously cultural, as you say, the culture wars. But how big and powerful is this a political lobby, the coal lobby in the US? Obviously, under Biden, I remember Senator Joe Manchin, coming from a coal state, that was a big deal. But how powerful is the lobby in pushing forward these policies?
Senator Manchin is a super interesting character because he is a Democrat, and the state of West Virginia is now very much a Republican state. I think they had the highest Republican vote share, the second highest Republican vote share after Wyoming, another Republican coal state. And what was interesting about him is how he became the holdout vote for Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, meaning that he could secure investments that would benefit West Virginia in the energy transition and have a positive impact on the state. And I think that we we forget about that kind of political power sometimes in regions that don't have so much outsized power from one Senate vote representing a state of 2 million people or so. But that really changed the trajectory of the IRA and meant that he was able to make sure it worked for communities in West Virginia. Now, that wasn't enough to keep him popular, especially given he's was a Democrat candidate. He then became independent and didn't run for re-election at the last election. Um, when I've spoken to people who are in and around that coal lobby, what they always tell me is that the oil and gas lobby is way, way larger. And I believe it. I think the oil and gas lobby has been a lot more effective at advocating for their interests than the American coal lobby. I think it helps that coal is so regionally concentrated. You basically have it in Appalachia and in western US in Wyoming and nearby states. And so it means that their political advocacy can be quite high. And they are very closely connected with elected representatives and civil servants in the states where coal is dominant. So I do think there's a strong coal lobby. I don't think coal lobbying is necessarily the only reason that Trump is supporting the coal industry. I think there's also this voter base and narrative around being anti-coal, this narrative around being anti-renewables, pro-coal, anti-democrat, anti-anything woke related to climate change that is more important than satisfying the interests of the coal lobby.
So given what you said earlier, you've got power demand from data centers. You mentioned higher natural gas. Do you think Trump can succeed then? So by the end of this term, do you think coal is going to have a resurgence in the US?
It's already had a resurgence in the past year. So it depends if you mean in absolute terms or in relative terms. I personally think coal will continue to decline in share of electricity, not just in the US, but all around the world. So in relative terms, one could call that a decline. I think in absolute terms, there's every possibility that coal stays at the level it's at, which would then be a win for preventing its decline. I think um, where mm, I think that there's a lot of states in the US that are not exposed to, there's a lot of states in the US that don't expose electricity to market forces. And in some of these states, it can mean that coal gets protected longer than it might otherwise survive on the electricity system. For example, I visited the Pleasance Power Station when I was in West Virginia, and this is a plant that is at the mercy of merchant prices. So it wasn't operating when I was there. It only comes on in extremely high periods of demand. But that's unusual in that market. A lot of the power plants are owned by utilities, and the utilities choose whether they continue running them or not. They make that decision on economic grounds, but they also can be influenced by what the state wants them to do. And if there's upstream jobs in the coal mining industry in that state, there are studies I've seen that suggest that they'll make investments in order to protect coal, whereas in states without upstream jobs, they decline to make those same investments. And so it's a fascinating way that mining industry interplays with the costs in the power sector.
Interesting. So just moving on then to the other side of the world, to China. Obviously, the elephant in the room consumes more coal than the rest of the world combined. Obviously, China's had an extremely impressive build out of renewable energy, solar, batteries, wind, you name it, and they have ambitious targets. But at the same time, they're still building new coal-fired power plants. And what I keep hearing is perhaps the coal-fired power plants won't be utilized all the time, and perhaps in some cases they can be backup power generation. But I'm just curious whether coal plants can play that role, given presumably the costs of restarting them suddenly or not running them all the time, or is it the case that China can pay for those costs? And just interested, is coal's role in China shifting, do you think?
Yeah, so coal consumption in the power sector went down in China in 2025, which was a landmark piece of news last year. And you can see why. They're installing record levels of renewable energy and record levels of all sorts of generation technologies. I mean, nuclear, hydro as well. They're building everything. So I'm not surprised that power consumption would come down, at least in a single year in China. I'll be interested to see if that trend continues this year. What I find interesting about this narrative that coal could be used as a backup power source or as a flexible power source is it depends what you really mean by flexibility. When people say that, they don't really mean that coal goes from 0 to 100 the way that gas power plants can or the way that batteries can deploy in the sector. They still need to maintain a base level of operations. And in India, that's above 50%. In China, they may get that down to 30% and ramp up from there. But that still means that you've got 30% utilization of this enormous coal fleet. And you then are not able to get rid of the emissions from that coal. This might also be deliberate so that you can keep coal mines in business and ramp down coal mining production over time instead of as quickly as market forces might dictate in the energy sector. What was interesting about coal power consumption going down last year is that coal production went up by 1%. And so that suggests a few things. It suggests that perhaps imports went down. It suggests stockpiling. It suggests other uses for coal. And I think what's troubling about China at the moment is the use for coal as a substitute for other chemicals, and making petroleum-based products out of coal, which is much more emissions intensive than the process is currently, but would give an offtake for coal mines as their power plant consumption goes down.
Yeah, that's what's surprising to me also, seeing these announcements of coal to chemicals plants, which, as you say, are more polluting. I mean, is that a sort of energy security concern from Beijing? I mean, why are they doing that?
I imagine it's a few different things. One of them is this making sure that coal mines don't collapse and go out of business overnight. which may happen if the power sector becomes fully liberalized as a market. It's not fully liberalized today, and it's not fully interconnected, which means even if you have massive renewable build out, you're not getting the full benefit of connecting all the systems up so that um, each province can actually reduce consumption of coal. They're all uh, still dependent on coal in each area, um, and incentivized to be so for energy security reasons. So I think that's part of it. I think the other reason is, as you said, that it avoids importing oil and gas or like petroleum products, hydrocarbons. Um, which reduces dependence on foreign countries, protects forex, all those reasons. Um, but then you would have to believe there's some shadow price on imports, there's some shadow price on how geopolitically independent you want to be, and the price of carbon. By one report, is 20 times more carbon intensive to use coal than it is for using imported petroleum. And so what shadow carbon price are they implying by switching to the system? So yeah, I think that there's these two drivers, geopolitical independence and keeping domestic coal mines from falling away too quickly. But I think there's this climate cost that isn't being fully baked in and doesn't seem to be in line with their commitment on emissions reduction.
Overall, I mean, it seems to me, given the renewable build out, I mean, coal's coming down in China, right? And it's likely to continue that pace. But as you say, the energy security, the fact they've got so much domestic coal. I mean, are there any sort of interesting technical things you see that can improve the way coal is burnt in China, whether that's, I don't know, blending it with other things or carbon capture and storage? Are they looking at that as well?
I see carbon capture and storage as largely a distraction to keep burning coal. It's not really an economic investment to make, and nor will it be for many years, versus alternatives like stopping using coal. So I don't see China pursuing that route with zeal. Uh, One interesting development that's happening in India actually is using batteries to store excess coal production because it's economic to do so at current battery prices, and then it reduces fatigue on the coal plants, keeps them operating at their full potential, which then reduces emissions per unit because they're not ramping up and down all the time. It's an interesting technical innovation, but I don't think it helps you reduce emissions much in your energy system. It helps India at least integrate more solar during the day and take advantage of those resources. But you can see this potentially being used to keep coal on the grid longer. Um, I think it's an interesting point blending coal with other fuels. You could imagine coal power plants being retrofitted to well, they have been retrofitted to become biomass plants in places like the UK. We have a famous solar plant. We have a famous biomass plant owned by Drax. It's really not cost effective to run that plant on biomass. They receive billions of pounds in government subsidies to run that facility, and it's also not clear that it's any better for the environment than coal. Some reports say it is, based on the life cycle of trees and what happens to the waste when they get cut down. But other reports say it's not, and that Drax misreports the trees that they use in their supply chain, and some of them are freshly cut trees, not waste. So I don't see biomass or biomass mixing as a solution to reduce the emissions from coal. Again, I see that as part of prolonging the use of coal and making it more expensive than it needs to be.
You mentioned India. Turning to India, I think the big growth in coal demand's forecast to come from India. You've done some traveling there. You went down a coal mine. You have a very interesting Substack post published today about coal in India, which sort of typifies a lot of your points that overall it's not that many jobs in India, but it's very concentrated amount of jobs in certain areas. I mean, do you see India continuing to increase the amount of coal it burns, or are they going to switch increasingly to renewables?
So the jobs point in India, I thought before I visited would be the big story about continuing to use coal, whereas in other countries coal jobs have gone away. I assumed that because India employed more people in the sector, it would be one of the salient points. But from talking to mine bosses, it really didn't seem like that was on their mind or on they weren't getting pressure from their superiors on keeping jobs. In fact, the opposite, outsourcing a lot of jobs, making sure that when people retire, they don't backfill if the machinery that they use can now cover the same output that workers once did. What I found really interesting on my trip was the way coal supports government revenue, and also the way land is such a big driver of land access is such a big driver of coal revenue. So the government has the ability to take over coal land and pay people to leave that land and then mine that resource. And you can quickly imagine that if they decided to move to a system that's fully renewable, that land would just sit undeveloped, that coal would sit unmonetized. And maybe that would be the most economically reasonable thing to do. I mean, Britain decided not to dig up all of its coal, even though we have so much still sitting beneath the earth here, because it wasn't economic. In India, it's still economic, at least for the time being. And so there's a push to acquire land, continue developing that land. And I visited this absolutely enormous coal mine in Orissa State, where people were on machines all throughout the mine and like an orchestra of tiny ant-like diggers and trucks off in the hills. And that to me seems to be the future of Indian coal mining, and actually coal mining in places like the US, where you have these massive open cut mines, very cheap to run, not that many jobs, but they can generate a lot of state revenue benefits from continuing to operate. Now, renewables in India are cheaper than coal. Solar is, and solar plus batteries increasingly is. And so power sector companies will be under pressure to procure more and more from renewable energy sources than from coal. But because of the rents that the government has in the coal industry, they're able to keep reducing taxes little by little if they wanted to keep coal cost competitive with renewables. And there's quite a substantial amount of cushion that they have in being able to do that. So I see last year's decline in coal in India, which was quite substantial. Coal power consumption declined 3% in a single year. I see that trend as potentially continuing. The majority of that decline was due to the economy, not to renewables deployment. So lower growth than expected, and also less heating like demand. But the in general, this trend of more renewables is happening in India too. They're building renewables like mad, and they're also promoting heavily a domestic manufacturing industry to support renewables growth. I just think that industry is not yet there to deliver the import substitution benefits of coal and to deliver these state rents that coal offers. And so it will not be straightforward to just see coal chipped away 3 percentage points per year for the next 30 years. Even that, I think, would be ambitious, given the plans that mine leaders have to continue operating through to 2060.
And that's right. You make an important point, which is they rely on Chinese solar and batteries. And this is a huge problem, right? And why we need to have more diversified supply chains, because presumably India doesn't want to be completely reliant on China for these clean energy technologies.
Exactly. When I've spoken to government officials even before my visit, I query, well, if solar is cheaper, why would you not want that for your citizens so that they can have cheaper electricity? And the response was just that we don't want to be overly dependent on cheap products from China. We'd rather have it be local Indian sourced products. So if you can make solar like that and batteries like that, that's amazing. And I think what I'm quite interested in now is how much of that supply chain is still dependent on China, even if you have manufacturing facilities located in India. How much of the upstream inputs, like raw materials, semi-manufactured materials that get put into the final product, is how much of that is still coming from abroad, and indeed even from China, where they have let's say geopolitical tensions with, even though they're neighbors and both very large economies.
Interesting. So just bring it back to the UK, where we are. The UK, obviously, the last coal-fired power plant closed. It's been a remarkable story of moving beyond coal. I think I'm right in your own mother grew up in a coal community in the UK. How does the UK fit into your thesis that it's not just about costs and economics?
The UK story of coal fits into my thesis because we had a leader that, despite the catastrophic impact she had on coal communities, took a decision to let market forces prevail in coal mining. And this is Margaret Thatcher I'm speaking about. So she went up against the coal unions in the UK, against her arch nemesis Arthur Scargill, head of the union, and she decided to shut down British coal because it was more expensive than importing coal and ultimately driving up costs in the energy system. I'm sure she had other political reasons besides making electricity cheaper for British consumers, like being able to defeat a very powerful union and take out some of her opposition. But her decision to let that market force prevail, despite the economic devastation, I think was critical to exiting coal from the British power system. There were other decisions later that also had an impact, a very positive impact, like introducing a carbon price. That instantly makes coal more expensive. It has twice as much carbon as its next most carbon intensive competitor, gas. And when the UK started deploying lots of gas power plants, these were what helped to phase out coal because these were cheaper. When you layer on a carbon price, that makes them even more compelling. And then the third big action the government's taken is promoting renewables through the contract for difference scheme and offering guaranteed contracts to make sure that power plants can get funding to get built, given that renewables are so capital intensive to get onto the grid. So I think that story of going upstream and looking at the mining sector as a way to get rid of coal in the power sector is not one I hear told particularly often in our world. I often hear people talk about at the power level that batteries and solar and all sorts of other technologies are cheaper than coal, so eventually coal will go away, without addressing these upstream considerations around jobs or the other macroeconomic benefits that I talked about. And what I think the UK did really badly, and what I'd like to also focus on in my book, is managing that transition. They basically let it free fall. My mother's town lost coal before the miners' strikes. The last coal was mined there in 1973, and the peak miners' strikes were in 84, 85. And her town doesn't really have any local industry anymore. It's a commuter town to Bristol and to Bath. People went to work at a local manufacturer, I think a bootmaker. They worked for the printmaker, but there wasn't that much going on there. So the town sort of died a little bit. And I think the devastation in the towns after the miners' strikes and mass unemployment was huge. And those communities, in some ways, haven't fully recovered from that damage. So I'd like to weave that story in to help people understand you can't let this free fall. You have to plan for what happens to workers. And when times are good, when you're generating profits from coal, you may want to set up a fund to invest in what happens when the profits from coal go away and when those communities will need to find new jobs. Because the communities are often built around coal. They're not built around big city hubs the way London is, where people can move into other jobs and sectors, and there's a skills agglomeration that attracts businesses. They're just set up for coal mining, and transitioning communities like that to other types of jobs is really difficult.
So, so obviously we have coal used for power plants, which I think is your main focus, but we also have metallurgical coal used for making steel and other industrial processes. That's much harder to decarbonize, I presume, than electricity generation. How do you see the decarbonization pathway for metallurgical coal?
Yeah, so coal for electricity consumption is around 2/3 of demand for coal today, and that's where I see the biggest prize for getting off coal is by reducing electricity demand for it, because other technologies are already cheaper. And the other 2/3 is for coal in industrial processes of all kinds. Around 1/8 of coal is used for steel making and that kind of metallurgical use case, and the rest is used in other processes, including in this coal to chemicals world that we were talking about. That I do see as more challenging, but it also represents a smaller, like just a portion of the total emissions. What I find interesting is that we actually do have technologies to replace steel making with electrification, so arc furnaces, not not using coal, and that technology is quite common already, but I think could be scaled up further to I have the notes for how big that is. I'm just trying to see if I can find. Oh yeah. Um 70%, oh yeah, something like 70% of steel is still made with met coal, and arc furnaces can pick up the rest, so 30%. We could be growing arc furnaces and then using electrification to make steel, and I think that's a really promising development. Um, but I do agree it's hard to imagine how the rest of the coal use cases can be decarbonized. And how I see that impacting coal globally is it will mean that countries with the highest quality coal will win and will stay in business. So Australia is a really good example of that. They have very high quality met coal, and that's a major part of their exports. And they'll stay in the market, probably for that reason, that their coal is the last coal you'll want to get rid of, because it's much harder to replace in industrial processes.
And just one region I realized we haven't really talked about is Southeast Asia, where I think also coal demand is set to grow the remainder of this decade. I mean, you have countries like Indonesia, obviously big coal exporters, but they also, an industry I'm familiar with, the nickel industry, they have on-site coal-fired power plants to power that industry. What's happening in Southeast Asia? Are they going to continue with coal, or will we see renewables become increasingly attractive?
I think that renewables are increasingly attractive all around the world, and in Southeast Asia. I would distinguish between countries that have a lot of domestic coal, like Indonesia, and countries that import coal, like Vietnam. I think that the political economy benefits of phasing out coal are much higher somewhere like Vietnam, which doesn't have such an extensive domestic mining industry, and is really then trading off decisions around cost, import, currency, foreign independence. And there you may see contracts locking coal into the power system. Suganda Srivastav has really interesting work on the impact of how coal is contracted in keeping it online, because you can't get out of these contracts for 15, 20, however many years. So adding a carbon price onto them can also mean costs just get passed on to consumers. It doesn't necessarily lead to phasing out the coal. But I think in general renewables will help to displace coal over time in those importing countries, subject to being able to connect to the grid. I know several years ago there was a lot of drama around connecting renewables to the grid in Vietnam in particular, because they had such a massive build out and then couldn't get it to where demand was. I think Indonesia is a massive coal story because they're also one of the world's largest exporters. They don't use nearly as much coal domestically as they export. And there, they've subsidized coal historically to make it cheap to use on the power sector. I think that will change because it costs money to subsidize coal, and it will allow then renewables to more effectively compete. And it will also save more production for export to the extent that imports are even going to grow for coal from Indonesia. Um, when I visited Indonesia as well and spoke to people there, including the head of a coal association. They're very much planning for coal to remain in that country. They're also baking in carbon capture as a way to keep coal. Whether that happens remains to be seen. And then you also have this point around political alignment with coal, where politicians own coal assets, and this can then influence how decisions are made. That is a story I heard quite commonly in Indonesia. But even without getting into that, there's other reasons why you might keep coal on the system there to protect coal mining jobs and continue this massive export market, and also because land use for renewables is quite restrictive there. Building on islands and using land for solar and wind can be challenging versus having one coal power plant on the island and then having the mining take place on a completely different island elsewhere in Indonesia.
What do you think we in the West should do? I mean, there is things like the Just Transition Partnership with Indonesia. I mean, do you think we should pay for these countries not to build coal-fired power plants?
I'm quite critical of the Just Energy Transition Partnerships approach, or JETP, um, and I think others are too. It's not just me. Uh, Indonesia has scrapped one of their big projects that was part of that initiative, Cirebon, and that project was going to shorten the life of a coal plant and compensate them for doing so. I think the couple of reasons I would critique something like JETP, one is that it's paying off power plant developers and owners that probably knew better when they were getting into the contracts what the outcome was going to be for coal. And often these power plant owners are also foreign companies, some of whom are shareholders in the development banks that are funding these payoffs. So I found that quite interesting looking at the Indonesian example in particular. I also think that the problem with JETP is it does ignore these upstream coal benefits. You're effectively paying off the power plant owner, but that doesn't change the incentive for the upstream to continue wanting to sell and to find a use for coal. And so it means that your negotiations can often get stuck because you're not really addressing the core problem if you're only focusing on the power sector. And indeed, negotiations in places like South Africa have really stalled for JETP. I do think continuing to build more renewables and storage is crucial and definitely helps, because once you have those assets, you ideally want to use them, and then you can at least reduce the cost of coal in the energy system to the extent it is exposed to market forces. I think what also will help is promoting flexible technologies more. What I mean by this is technologies that help to reshape the demand profile. We often think of coal as necessary because it delivers reliable baseload power, but that's not actually how the economy consumes electricity anymore. And there's a lot of electrical consumption, for example, EV charging or heating, that can be shifted depending on when your intermittent power is at its most available and at its least available. And you can start seeing a system where car batteries can be deployed to compensate for lower than expected wind generation or the evening hours of solar, instead of always having to have coal running as baseload. Another really interesting example of this is changing when hot water heaters and heating runs. In Australia, the hot water heaters are set to run in the middle of the night by default because that's when coal was cheapest. But now, of course, it's cheapest in Australia to run hot water heaters in the middle of the day when solar is online and there isn't enough demand to soak up that supply. So these kinds of changes seem really small, but can have a massive impact on affecting what you actually need to deliver from the energy system, and whether coal is therefore the cheapest way to deliver that service.
That's really interesting. And just a sort of final question. I mean, you really pinpoint a lot of the reasons why we still burn coal. So what are the solutions to move off coal quicker? I mean, you mentioned some of the technical things around the grid and switching demand, but how do you break up some of the other political or jobs or government revenue? Do you have any thoughts about how we can actually move off coal quicker?
I think it's really hard to break up the political side. My thoughts on how you start to think about it are setting aside funds for communities that are coal dependent today. So you might increase taxes on coal and make it less and less competitive on the energy grid. But then people know that those taxes are going to something that will help their community once coal eventually goes away. As an example of this, Queensland got a bumper tax break when coal prices went up around the world after the Ukraine war. Yes, the Ukraine war had a massive impact on increasing coal prices, which still impacted then Australian electricity prices. They decided to use this bumper tax take to subsidize rail, when they could have set that money aside for a community fund that then supports the investment into other kinds of businesses that you might want once coal jobs go away. So that options like that, I think, are a compelling way for governments to get political buy-in. If they can say, well, the money we're raising from coal is then going to support communities or health impacts, it's not just going into our general budgets. I think a global carbon tax would obviously be the holy grail, but that's probably not going to happen. What I think is interesting about Europe is that they're introducing this carbon border adjustment mechanism, which then means all trade products will be exposed to their carbon prices effectively. And to the extent that countries have enough power to level the playing field in that sense, it can then change the economics enough that your coal industry and supporting that might not be worth tanking the competitiveness of all your manufactured goods going to Europe. So I think that development is a really interesting one. And then I think more awareness of the trade-offs that we're making to protect jobs, to increase energy security and independence, to reduce foreign exchange usage would help, because we're not currently seeking political buy-in for those decisions. Governments are just assuming that people want to protect those jobs, or they're appealing to the constituencies that come to them with the problem and letting power prices potentially be higher as a result. And I think if people started to engage more with what the different trade-offs are in the energy system, instead of just believing that the government's optimizing for the lowest cost, that would really help. And I think that political reckoning is happening, ironically, with the renewable sector, and how we've been promised that renewables will lower cost. And it's clear from rising electricity bills and increasing penetration of renewables that more renewables has not led to lower cost. There's complicated reasons for this, and it's not squarely possible to blame renewables, but unpacking that connection for people and making them understand this is what you're getting if you support coal or if you support renewables across the economy, I think is really helpful. And that's one of the messages I'm trying to get across with my book.
Well, thanks so much, Lucy, and we're looking forward to your book. What's the provisional title?
It's called Slow Burn. Slow Burn, Why We Can't Quit Coal. Slow burn, how to quit coal, depending on the positive or negative framing you'd want to have.
Great, and I recommend everyone follows your Substack, which is also called Slow Burn, and I'll post a link in the notes to Substack. Well, thanks so much for joining me today. It's been really interesting to hear your thoughts, and I think we should all pay more attention to why it is that we're burning so much coal. Thanks very much.